Now, this lesson is one that I'm excited for, and it's actually from one of my favorite passages I've studied. And these couple of books are probably some of the books I've studied more than about any other. And I really enjoy them, and I'm excited to get to preach from them this morning. So I want to start this morning by showing you some pictures. And it's sort of a word association, but you'll see where I'm going with this. But I'm curious as to how your mind processes these things. And I don't have some fancy bill like Brother Parker put together this morning, but something to kind of get your mind thinking. That's what I want you to do. I want you to think. All right? I'm going to show you the first picture. Now, if you see a pair of roller skates that looks fun, your eyes are not that good. To me, I see death on wheels. And I think about how many times I almost died in skating rinks. What about this one? If you see lawn darts as a great and fun game for your children to play with outside, I see questionable parenting choices. And I don't know who really looked at this and thought this was a good idea to give somebody. I can just see Austin and John looking back there. We got lawn. You go step. I'm going to throw it at you. You throw it at me. Questionable parenting choices. Now, I got one more. If you see in this image a husband playing a cute and innocent prank on his wife by putting his foot on the scale while she weighs herself, you had better look again. This is a man that doesn't know that he's about to be looking at the ceiling. And he better hopefully have a very comfortable couch. Now, here's the real reason behind those pictures. Do you know something every one of those have in common with each other? Every one of those are recipes for disaster. That's what they all have. Something bad is going to come out of each and every one of them. I don't know if anything worse is going to come out of that than you put me in roller skates. But still, every one of those are bad. And yet, guess what crazy thing happens when you see all these things that are recipes for disaster? People line up to do them anyways. Even if they know it's a recipe for disaster, it doesn't matter. They're going to line up and they're going to do it anyways. And it really makes you think, at least it did for me, about all the things in each and every one of our lives that would certainly fit that bill, but things in our lives that are going to end in disaster. And you know they're going to end in disaster. And you think about that in terms of sin especially. Now, I love this too. Even though the recipe for disaster is there and you can see it coming, what's the normal response when something bad happens as a result of something that was obviously going to be bad? You know what the response is? I can't believe that happened. You believe that happened? Like stepping on the scale when your wife is trying to weigh herself. How do you think that's about to end? Like, it's not going to go well. But guess what? We do it anyways. Now, one example that always comes to mind and why I say is one of my favorite passages. I know you hear that a lot, but this is genuinely a couple of books that I've probably studied more than anything else. King David comes to mind. King David, especially in 2 Samuel chapter 11. Go ahead and turn there in your Bible. 2 Samuel chapter 11. Now, you got King David, a man after God's own heart, at least for a while anyways, who plays around with this recipe for disaster until he gets bit by it, until he finally consumes it. And then he had to learn the hard way, but it's an account that teaches us just so many important lessons. So 2 Samuel chapter 11, we're going to explore David's recipe for disaster. We're going to read in this chapter the first 5 verses, and then we'll come back and break them down from there. 2 Samuel chapter 11, beginning verse 1. It happened in the spring of the year, at the time when kings go out to battle, that David sent Joab and his servants with him and all Israel. And they destroyed the people of Ammon, and they besieged Rabbah. But David remained at Jerusalem. Then it happened one evening that David arose from his bed and walked on the roof of the king's house. And from the roof he saw a woman bathing. And the woman was very beautiful to behold. So David sent and inquired about the woman, and someone said, "Is this not Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite?" Then David sent messengers and took her, and she came to him and lay with her, for she was cleansed from her iniquity, and she returned to her house. And the woman conceived, so she sent and told David and said, I am with child. Stephen Arterburn, he wrote a very interesting book that's called Every Man's Battle. And I was reading some snippets from this book when I was working on the sermon. And I wouldn't say I've read the whole book. I've read a lot of snippets from that book. And I thought some of the things that he highlights in there are very interesting. His main point is essentially this. Regardless of the character of the man, desire is going to be something every man has to deal with. Every one of us. Now, of course, it's dealt with on different levels and with different things by different men. But nonetheless, it is a problem. It most certainly was a problem in the case of King David, which is remarkable for me to think about because this is David. You think about all the things he did and just the descriptor alone that we've already said, he's a man after God's own heart. Israel, if you look at their flag today, you still see that blue star, the Star of David. This is David we're talking about. The Messiah is going to be David 2.0. And yet the recipe for disaster was found, and he made the choice to dive right in. So I want to look at this account closer, but what I really want to do, as I normally do when we go through these kind of accounts, is I want to find out how that reality of what David did impacts your life still to this day by the same choices that we make so we can be better prepared when the situation comes. Because I want you to remember this as we go. This didn't happen to a nobody. This didn't happen to somebody we would call a new babe in Christ or someone with a little faith. This happened to a great king with a great faith, a giant slaying kind of faith. And this happened to him. So I want you to notice the first part of the passage again. Because in this passage, you're going to see one little word. And some of the biggest impact in all of the Bible comes from those smallest words. So I want to see if you can find the word I'm talking about. So verse 1 again. It happened in the spring of the year, at the time when kings go out to battle, that David sent Joab and his servants with him and all Israel. And they destroyed the people of Ammon and besieged Rabbah, but David remained in Jerusalem. So a little bit of history here, because this doesn't make a lot of sense to us when we hear about it. I don't want it to be confusing. It's springtime now, and it says, well, this is the time when kings go to war. Springtime to me, as somebody that grew up playing sports, springtime to me sounds like baseball. And so to hear, well, springtime to them meant war, it sounds kind of odd. It's really not. What that means is, in the wintertime, that was their really rainy season. You had the early rains, the latter rains, but you got nothing but dirt roads, early rains, latter rains. The roads become just mud puddles. And you've got these giant chariots of iron, these horses, and the roads become impassable. And so you wait until everything dries up, and then when springtime comes, the rain stops, the roads dry, everybody goes to war. Like you've been cooped up in a house for so long, you go to war. Now, if you study the life of David, you would think this is his favorite time of year. David's a fighter. He's a scrapper. He's a man of the battlefield. He defeated Goliath. But just listen to, and I didn't even, we'd go be here for the next 30 minutes if I started going through his whole list of accolades. But whether it was the Philistines, the Geshurites, the Amalekites, he took the city of Jerusalem, whether it was the Syrians, the Edomites, you could just go down the list of everyone David defeated. Just battle after battle. And I say that because the point is, David's meant to be among the soldiers. That's where David belongs. And in fact, you remember why God would not let David build the temple? David wanted to build God's temple. And God wouldn't because essentially you have bloody hands. Your hands have blood in them. So the verse starts out all well and good. It's time for war, and time that you think David would like. But these little bitty words pop up. Little bitty words. But David remained in Jerusalem, which makes no sense. We're not told why David remained in Jerusalem, but he does. Now, we can make educated guesses, and they would be just that. Maybe he's a little older now. He's middle-aged. You know, war's more of a young man's game. Maybe he's getting older. He's a king now. He's in the palace. He's gotten used to his bed and all of his luxuries. And so, sleeping out in a tent on the dirt doesn't sound very appealing. And plus, let's be honest, the battle is in Rabbah, which isn't far from Jerusalem. And so maybe he just thought he could manage. I don't know. Whatever the reason David had for this, it brings us to the first truth, the first ingredient in David's recipe for disaster. David wasn't where he was supposed to be. That is ingredient number one in the recipe for disaster. He was not where he was supposed to be. In fact, I want you to understand this. Everything we're about to read and study in this lesson would not have been the case had David been where he was supposed to be. This lesson wouldn't even exist if he was in the battlefield. In my mind races to examples in the Bible of this, of people where they weren't supposed to be. You remember Abraham, he goes to the promised land with Sarah. There's a famine. He takes off and he leaves there and he goes to Egypt. Well, then as soon as he gets to Egypt, he has to lie about who Sarah is. He has all these problems, and then again he leaves, and he goes back, and he wasn't where he's supposed to be. Israel wandered 4 decades in the wilderness, not where they were supposed to be, and you can look across and see it. Judas, great example. Judas left the upper room with Jesus, and he went to go find the Pharisees and the high priest. He left where he was supposed to be. Being where you're not supposed to be is one of the main ingredients in the recipe for disaster. Listen, you know this. This is one of the easier points. You think about this in your own life. Think about how many times you've been in the wrong place. And you knew you were in the wrong place. You knew you had no business being where you were. And then by the same token, the places that you knew you should have been, you weren't. And Lord knows I can say that many times about examples in my own life. But you think about it. You think about how many people today spend their time in the world and they're looking for things. They're looking for purpose. They're looking for meaning in life. They're trying to find hope. I know I'm searching for peace. I'm doing all these things and they're doing it in the wrong place. They're not in the right place. So instead, here's what normally happens. And again, you can see this. All right? I'm not giving you some new revelation you've never seen before in your own life. When you start doing that, when you're in the wrong place, looking for answers in the wrong place, you start turning to other people for answers. You turn to drugs for answers. You turn to addiction, to bad relationships, toxic environments, bad circle of friends, dangerous hobbies. And you just go deeper and deeper and deeper into that recipe because you're not where you're supposed to be. Why do you think Jesus said this in Matthew 11, verse 28? Come unto me, there's the place. Come unto me, all ye that labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Why do you think he said that? The place you belong is with Jesus. The place everybody belongs is with Jesus. And yet you think about that little word that we just talked about in 2 Samuel, but. I know I belong with Jesus, but. Now this comes, and really it blends, the second part we're going to look at. We're going to go even deeper into this now. Notice verse 2. Then it happened one evening that David arose from his bed and walked on the roof of the king's house. And from the roof he saw a woman bathing, and the woman was very beautiful to behold. Now the city of Jerusalem, you just kind of understand the topography. The city of Jerusalem is built on hills, right? And so the king, he's the big dog in the yard. Therefore, his house, his palace is way up high. He's got the highest palace. And that overlooks essentially all of Jerusalem. So you've got all these houses with these flat-top roofs, and people would use these roofs as living spaces. They would use them for storage, for praying. Apparently, some would use them for bathing. And so David, he's walking out late one night, and I'm guessing he couldn't sleep, and he sees something on a rooftop. He sees a woman taking a bath. And listen, if the verse ended here, again, we wouldn't be having this conversation. It would be over. But the verse doesn't end there. I mean, because again, can you help what you see? Listen, like, you think about this. he's out, he's on a little innocent stroll, and he just looked, oh, there's somebody taking a bath. Do you know what that's like today? Have you ever been at home and you're just scrolling through TV and you're changing channels and you're doing all these different things? And you see something that you shouldn't be looking at? It's just the same thing. Or, we'll go even younger now. I don't, Brianna and them are just going to be all kind of confused on what I'm talking about. But you're scrolling through your phone. You know what you can find on your phone today? Everything. You can find everything on your phone that you want to look at that you should be looking at. And so you get this idea of just, you can't help but what you see, all right? We'll go with that. You can't help what you see. But now in this verse, there are two big words, once again, I want you to notice. And again, it's these smaller words that make some of the largest impact. He saw and behold. David saw the woman, and to see the woman suggests a glance. He passed by, he saw her, he couldn't help it, there's no harm, no foul, he just saw her, okay? But the second word, behold, now suggests something very different. See, that gaze got his attention. That double take got him. And again, think about the words of Jesus, Matthew 5:28. I say to you that whoever looks on a woman to lust after her has already committed adultery. It wasn't the look, it was the gaze. Now, women, I'm going to let you in. This is going to be a bombshell of a revelation for you. I know you're not going to understand. You're not going to know this. I say that very facetiously, of course. Men are visually driven. We are driven by what we see, especially along the lines of desire. Why do you think the younger men are, you see a very attractive woman, the rubberneck approach, you're trying not to look, but you're trying to look. The older you get, you see the men you go by, and it becomes less about the women and like the hot rod you see, or if you're Marshall, it's a gun you see for sale somewhere. We're driven by what we see. But again, it's what you do with what you see that makes the difference. What did Joseph do when he was in Potiphar's house? And Potiphar's wife is there, and she's trying to pull him in, or she's seducing him. Did Genesis 39, did it say he just stopped and he stared and he well, Lord, you brought me to this situation. I guess this is where you want me to be. Did he try to justify? No, he literally ran away from her to the point she grabs his, he runs out naked. And he gets away from her. And that's the same thing each and every one of us can do in that situation. In fact, this is going to be a little bit of a sidebar here. That's something we do for each other. As brethren in the church. And I've heard people, and again, I'm trying to be careful with the soapbox moment here. Because I'll hear somebody say, well, what's the purpose of the church? Is the church really necessary? One of the things we do in the church, because guess what? If you start asking the question, well, who struggles with desire? Now, women, I can't speak for you. Every male in here would raise their hands. We struggle with desire. But as the brotherhood here, one with another, we understand each other's desires. We lift each other up. We encourage each other. That's what we do. We're not alone. That's the emphasis here. We're not going through this alone. Whether women going through different situations, family going through different situations, if you're in some traumatic deal with your family, would you rather do it alone or would you rather do it with a group of people around you? It is almost as if Jesus understood this. But David, he's hooked now. Oh man, she's beautiful. Now, ladies, we're picking on David here, and rightfully so. This is David's sin. But we could very easily have a conversation about why Bathsheba was on the roof bathing where everybody could see her. Knowing that anyone above her house could easily look out and see her naked bathing outside of it. And don't get me wrong, David is guilty. I'm not taking anything away from David. But ladies, you have to understand how guys operate. You have to help guys out. And believe me, what's happening today with clothing that's been normalized is not helping guys at all. In fact, women are told to basically sexualize themselves. But I'm going to digress on that point. What was the recipe for disaster here, and how did it spiral? First off, David wasn't where he was supposed to be. Secondly, I want you to notice the situation David was in. He's out there all by himself. And you say, well, why is that a problem? Because if I went around the room and I started asking everybody, and I know, I've gotten to know most of you very well. And there's more I got to know. Maybe there's some I don't want to know. As far as details about you, I don't want to know you. But if I were to go and start asking people, and I start with Brianna, and I just work my way all the way around to Stephen over here, and I say, raise your hand if you would prefer to be alone. Probably half the church, I kind of like being by myself. I kind of like being alone. I'm not really a social butterfly. A lot of people do that. A lot of people feel that way. But I want you to think about how much stronger the pull of temptation can be when you're by yourself. And I'm going to tell you what I mean. Something I find just amazingly fascinating to me is Jesus. It's always Jesus, right? I mean, everything comes back to Him. But when Jesus was in the crowds, He would be ridiculed, He'd be mocked. I mean, they were trying to beat Him, they were trying to surround Him. But do you know the only time the Bible specifically talks about Jesus and temptation and dealing with temptation is when the Spirit drove Jesus in the wilderness alone, and when Jesus was in the Garden of Gethsemane, further in, alone. That's when Satan's coming after him. See, Jesus, He comes back to the apostles. They're asleep. He says, what are you doing? Pray that you don't fall into temptation. And He's linking Himself to that same situation because He's dealing with it. As He went into the garden, when He was alone, Satan's trying to tempt Him. It's the same thing here, because isolated and alone, there's no support system, there's no encouragement. You're left alone with your thoughts and your desires. And newsflash, that can be dangerous. Jesus knew this. And so when He sends His disciples out, you remember how He sent them out? 2 by 2. He knew they needed support for each other. David, he's alone. But he's not alone. He's married. He's not just married. He's multiple times married, which is a problem in itself, because God's plan was one man, one woman, and I get that's argued today. You can argue till you're blue in the face. That's God's plan. David has 7 wives. He has 10 concubines. He could have left the situation he was in, even though it's still wrong to have that many wives. He could have left the situation he was in, gone back and just been with his wife, been with somebody, got away from that situation and not made it worse. And so again, why do you think the Lord established the church? I'm going to keep bringing the church up over and over again. Why do you think Christians, why do we call each other brothers and sisters? I yelled at Brianne this morning. I went full big brother mode on her. I'm not going to air her business. I went full big brother mode on her. I didn't really yell at her. Don't start thinking that. Because the Lord knew we need each other. That we're not meant to be alone. In fact, it's still I don't know, I laugh every time I think about this. Husbands and wives. God created perfection in the garden. Adam's there. He's there with the animals. Do you remember what he says? He looks down, he sees Adam, he sees the animals, he sees the garden, he sees perfection. You know what he says? Yeah, that ain't good for man to be alone. He knew we weren't supposed to be alone. And I can't help but think about that. Every time I hear someone say, I'm a faithful person, but I don't need the church. I'm not going to prioritize church. What you're going to do then is and you all heard the illustration. I'm not going to go through the whole illustration. But you think about the church as that burning fire. And all of a sudden you decide, well, I'm going to take one coal out because I don't need the church. I'm going to just set the coal over here kind of by itself. I'm going to be alone. Guess what happens to that coal? It stops. It burns out. Nothing's left. But you put it back in the fire, it lights back off again. It's the same illustration. David is all alone on the roof. He's not where he was supposed to be. And guess what he decided? He doesn't have support. He's by himself. And what he decides, he doesn't run headlong into this just yet. We got a whole whopping verse before we get there. But he takes a step. One step. Step towards desire. Verse 3, so David sent and he inquired about the woman. And someone said, well, is this not Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite? You know, the question almost sounds innocent enough. We know it's not, but it almost sounds innocent. It's just a little bit of information, just to kind of entertain the idea. And then a voice of reason speaks of, hey, David, that's Bathsheba. Yeah, that's the wife of Uriah. Sounds like the voice of reason. Hey, David, never mind, you got 7 wives and 10 concubines. This is the wife of Uriah. So in David's recipe for disaster, let's see if we're getting all about it. I don't want to miss any ingredients here. All right? He's not where he's supposed to be. He's all alone with his temptations. And now look what he does. He takes one little step towards sin. He's just asking a question. He hadn't sent for her yet. He's just asking a question. Just one little step. Do you understand how many colossal failures in the history of humanity began with a single step towards sin? Just a little gaze. Just a little look. I'm just going to try it once. It's not that big of a deal. It's just a little step. Then it's just another step. And then another step until you can't see back anymore. And I can't help but remember the specific word, and we spent like a whole class back here on it when we were going through the book of Hebrews chapter 2. And the Hebrews writer there in verse 1 says, therefore we must give the more earnest heed to the things we've learned, lest we drift away. That drift away. And what he does is he uses a nautical term that's describing a miserably slow, mind-numbingly slow drift. Little step. Y'all have seen me, did this same illustration. Little step. One little look. One little glance. One little try. One little text. All these different things. And you've gone so slow and so far that you can't see the shore anymore. That's what he's describing here. But verse 4, again, you got one little snippet and you jump to verse 4 and there it is. It's over. See, David can't see the shoreline anymore. Then David sent messengers and took her. And she came to him and lay with her, for she was cleansed from her impurity, and then she returned to her house. You know how much I hate to read this verse? This is about one of the coldest, crudest verses you're going to read in the Bible. This is a disgusting verse to read. I don't even want to think about this associated with the great King David. The man whose faith took on Goliath. To now, filthiness, crudeness. That one step meant he gave in to his desires. And do you want to know what the scary reality with sin is? This is a scary reality. And again, I'm not going to get crude myself here. But the scary reality with this is I have no doubt whatsoever it wasn't fun. I have no doubt whatsoever they didn't enjoy themselves that night. For one night. Because that's all it lasted. One night. You know what the Bible calls that? The Bible calls that the passing pleasure of sin. See, again, I'm going to go back to the Hebrews writer again. When the Hebrews writer describes Moses, Hebrews chapter 11, you kind of get this Hall of Faith chapter, and he goes through Moses, and then when you get to verse 24, it says, by faith Moses, when he became of age, he refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. And then you get this phrase, it says, he would choose rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the passing pleasure of sin. And then verse 26, you get that he esteemed the reproach of Christ's greater riches. You see, in this moment of weakness, in the wrong place, isolated by himself, David didn't do that. He chose the passing pleasure of sin. Now, aren't you thankful that none of us can say we've done that? Brother William knows I'm joking. See, I wish that were the case, but that's not. This is something we deal with. In fact, I go back to the book. Every man's, and again, when I say that every man's sin, understand, women, you're just as guilty in your own right. Y'all have something different. Your desires are going to be our desires and vice versa. But guess what happens when that recipe for disaster is baked into some dish you can no longer refuse? What you get is you get the spiral of sin. You get this downward spiral because now you gave it. It was just a night. It was supposed to just be fun. It wasn't supposed to be a big deal. Bathsheba got pregnant. She gets pregnant from this affair. And so the rest of the chapter for the good King David is nothing more than a cover-up attempt by him to hide the reality of his sin. That's all this is. The rest of the chapter is hiding his sin. He brings Uriah home from war with this grand plan. I'm going to send him home. He's going to be with his wife, and he's going to think it's his kid that's born. It's not mine. He's just spiraling, going deeper and deeper. But as he's going, he doesn't anticipate a problem. He doesn't anticipate the integrity of Uriah. And I have so much respect for what he tells the king, verse 11. You know, he's trying to get him to go home, and Uriah looks at David and he says, David, the ark and Israel and Judah, they're dwelling in tents. Should I go to my house and eat and drink and lay with my wife? That's integrity. And you know that had to have stung when he said that? Oh, that had to have hurt. And yet it shouldn't have been a surprise. Do you know Uriah was not just a common soldier? David knew who Uriah was. It shouldn't have surprised him one bit. See, we read this and like, okay, well, this is Uriah. I don't know anything about him. Yes, you do. In 2 Samuel 23, Uriah is one of David's valiant men. He's been with David. He goes all the way back in time with David when he was running from Saul. They have history. They've been together. Long before David's on a roof gazing at his wife, they were together in the wilderness running. Which, by the way, is why Uriah's house was so close to David's. He's one of the 30 men. David even tries to get him drunk. Like, well, this will cover it up. I'm going to get him to drinking, then he'll go home, and then I can cover up the sin until he's left with one option. But now you got to remove Uriah. If Uriah is going to hold to his integrity, but now you've got to just remove the problem altogether. And that's what he does. He has Uriah killed in battle. At which point he takes Bathsheba to be his wife. I guess 7 and 10 wasn't enough. But it's what I want you to see in that that's so important. It started seemingly innocent. And yet you look and it just spirals. 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 The sin in our life, it just spirals. And I couldn't find who wrote this, but my goodness, is accurate. It said, be careful of what you entertain. Sin fascinates before it assassinates. You know there's no such thing as an innocent sin. Uriah was a dead man walking. He didn't even know it. The baby they conceived was as good as dead before it was born. That's because the consequences of sin are a very serious thing. Now, the good news for David is that we know David didn't stay here. This was a season. The next chapter you get to, and for good reason, he finds out the child is going to die. The child's not going to be able to survive. In chapter 12, David spends 7 days in fasting. He's praying to God. He's laying on the ground. He's reflecting on the consequences of his sin. He's in mourning. He's tore up by what he did because Nathan's done come to him and hit him like a 2x4 across his head when he realized what he had done. And you think the whole time, how did he not know? But what we actually read here from that point was David's past, not his future. Now again, David's not perfect. There's a great lesson that I want us to take away as we wind this down. You see, the recipe for disaster is always just around the corner because that's where sin is. Sin lurks just around the corner. Especially when we're not supposed to be, we're all alone, we're isolated, and we decide that, well, I can take on the world by myself. Faith or whatever, sin's lurking, no big deal. I like to be alone. And people are taught early on in age, hey, you don't need anybody else. You do whatever you want to do. You can do everything on your own. And yet the Lord purposely designed a family. Accountability. Purpose. He designed His church. And then comes a step. It's just a little step. Hey, who is she? Simple question. was sheep. And there goes his spiral. That's all it took. And yet for David, all the while, God is still there, just and patient to forgive. Didn't remove the consequences. It just meant that he could receive forgiveness. For those like David, willing to repent, willing to make that change. So when you hear this account and you hear the recipe for David's sin, I hope it makes you think this question. Because again, this recipe for David's sin, you can change that out and put your name above it. So I hope it makes you think, does something like that describe where you are now? Or does it hopefully describe where you were in the past? You see, what I hope from this is I hope, one, you learn the importance of what's being described, not being where you're supposed to be, being alone, taking that one little step. But I hope you find courage in this, because I know that in all of my failures in doing the same thing, I realize what David had to learn, that yes, I failed. There's consequences to my sin. There's problems that come out of sin. But then I stop and remember, I don't have to stay there. Then I think, well, you know what? And I love the way, he won't like me doing this, but I even like the way Brother William, he prays. He makes a point to say, for my sin. He makes it personal. And I like the way he does that. My sin. So I stop and I remember what David did, and I think, you know what? Jesus died on the cross, and I always say, for our sins. But no. For my sins. That even though I failed him, he died for my sin. That through faith, through repentance, through me being willing to change, have that mind change, and confessing Jesus as my Lord and Savior, that if I'm baptized into his body, I'm washed clean. Those sins are gone. They're as far as the east is from the west, or what we read in the book of Micah this past Wednesday. He takes those sins and he throws them as far as he can into the depths of the sea, and they're gone. Those things come from obedient submission, obedient faith. It links us to that sacrifice, and it opens up for us the gates of God's grace. So that, we see this recipe for disaster. It describes so many people today, and yet you don't realize the recipe for life is just right there beside it. And it's powerful. It's the power of eternal life. And so I'm going to wrap up with this. I want you to think about that question. Have I described your past, or have I described your present? If I've described your present, understand what it means. Understand that you're in that David situation right now, but the promise of life, the recipe for life is right there for the taking. I just described it for you. So if you're in need this morning, Brother Marshall, he's going to come lead us in a song here in just a moment. Hopefully he'll get the right one. But if you're one that's in need, if you're bearing the weight of sin, if what I just described still describes your present, you didn't need the church, you drifted away from everything you knew you were supposed to be, and you want to make that right, and you want to be who God called you to be, where God called you to be, when God called you to be, so that you can take up your cross daily and follow after him, and the invitation is going to be for you. If you're ready to answer the gospel call, we stand ready and willing to help you with that. Or if you're one that needs some prayers in the congregation, we're here and we'll help any way we can. Whatever we do, come as we stand and we sing this invitation song.
Hark the gentle voice of Jesus falling tenderly upon your ear. Sweet his cry of love and pity calling. Turn and listen, stay and hear. Ye that labor and are heavy laden, lean upon your dear Lord's rest. Ye that labor and are heavy laden, come and I will give you rest. Then his loving tender voice obeying, bear his yoke, his burden take. Find the yoke his hand is on you laying, light and easy for his sake. Ye that labor and are heavy laden, lean upon your precious